we wanted to have this foundation to do more of applied and action research so that this kind of application of anthropology, its philosophy, concepts, and methods can be applied for various social problems and also very many issues which are very pertinent. So we've been doing a few applied research and action research at the same time, trying to connect to the younger scholars so that we have a good kind of network where we can also work together. So this is a humble beginning, and we've been organizing few guest lectures. We have a website, and we are trying to keep that updated so that more and more people can listen to the lectures which have been organized even later. So today we are very glad to have with us Dr. Alison Khan. She is also a documentary filmmaker, and she studied from University of London, did her master's in anthropology, and then DPhil from University of Oxford in anthropology in digital media. She was director, Oxford Academy of Documentary Filmmaking, and currently also with a very long, distinguished career for 14 years and more than that. And her areas of experience are digital media, education solutions, TV and independent film productions, digital screen and museum exhibitions, digital film and photographic archival research, creativity and strategies for collaborative interests with other companies and associations. And also she is board of directors for training and course development in many institutions. And we are very glad to have Alison with us in Anthropos India Foundation. Also, we plan to start off a research project with her on digital children, and especially looking at children during the COVID time. And we are very hopeful to bring a lot of interesting aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact on children, especially doing online education. And we all know the kind of digital divide we have in the country, and not just in India. I'm sure Alison will share that it's there in England also, that not every child can afford to have an online education. So it's going to be an interesting study which we are going to start and then share when it's done. But today Alison is going to talk about beyond the visible, coding, decoding, and recoding as an anthropological methodology. So a brief abstract which I have shared, I'm sure all of you have read, so I'm not going to repeat the abstract of today's talk, and I'll hand it over to Dr. Alison Khan to talk about this particular very interesting topic, because we also want to focus more on methodology and the vibrancy in the discipline itself, to talk about the different methods which can be applied in different fields, and this we can see in the visual medium. Dr. Alison, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you.
Over to
Thank you so much, Sunita. Well, as always, it's a pleasure to be with you. I think what's really important with our relationship is that we're adopting that cross-cultural, cross-disciplinary approach, that collaborative kind of relationship that we must all be open to. And it's interesting that I've been looking back. I'm with my anthropological research. One of my loves is history, and I'm always very aware of the history of our discipline. Where were we? What did we think before? Why did we think this? And who are the we that are thinking this? And some of the elements in today's looking back at the 1997 edition called Rethinking Visual Anthropology, I see that there were many opportunities in the past to collaborate with psychology, with public health people, and be much more applied in our approaches. So I'm going to take this lecture into 3 parts, if that's okay. It's inspired, of course, by the book, Rethinking Visual Anthropology, which was edited by Morphy and Banks. And Marcus Banks was my professor at Oxford University when I joined in the year 2000. And this book was relatively new. And I came to Oxford because I wanted to study with Marcus Banks. He died 3 weeks ago. And so it's been a really reflective experience to go back over that work that brought me to Oxford 20 years ago, and to think of how things have changed, how visual anthropology was setting out. It was resetting a new course, a new direction in methodology at the time, and it brought together in this book many different types of anthropologists. So I'm going to just focus on a couple of aspects of that book because it's such a broad book, and I happily have met many of the people now who have contributed to that book, and sadly a few have passed away since. So really taking up that baton into the next generation, we want to reconsider what was said at the end of the 20th century and what do we think of it now? How has that changed? And how did visual anthropologists see their own discipline back in 1997? So I'm going to divide this lecture into 3 parts. The first part, I'm looking at Anna Grimshaw's chapter in Rethinking Visual Anthropology. It's called The Eye in the Door, Anthropology, Film and the Exploration of Interior Space. And this is one of the chapters that forms part of a core of anthropologists looking at anthropology in many different ways. The introduction to Rethinking Anthropology makes that scholarly connection with material cultural studies, and an historical affiliation is made. It merges the project of visual anthropology with material culture studies, which have been very vibrant since the writing cultures debate, and really from the 1990s onwards. In Oxford, I speak very much, if I think, let's place myself, I learned anthropology in England, in London, in Oxford. So this is very much the Oxford school of thought. But Rethinking Anthropology went far beyond Oxford and has influenced many different cultures and different universities. But the school of thought from where I come from sets out a certain agenda for anthropology. So that's the first part. I'm going to look at how Anna Grimshaw looks back at the history of her own discipline with regard to filmmaking especially. The second part, I offer my own extension of her thesis, looking at Marshall McLuhan and Jean Rouch, and looking at how we move beyond the Second World War and see new types of methodologies due to new technologies that have been created and perfected, especially in the camera, and how sync sound becomes part of a new methodology of capturing and documenting the other. And Jean Rouch is a great example of one of the first to use this type of method in anthropological research. So there are new codes of methodology happening, and Marshall McLuhan, although not an anthropologist, is one of the most important people to discuss when we're looking at media and the evolution of media in the 20th century. The third part I'll be looking at is really some of the work I've done over the last 20 years, and to show visually in a diagram that I often use how invention and innovation speeds up at a pulse that we can hardly keep up with, and how these methodologies culminate in the recent last 10 years, where the space of anthropology is gradually becoming occupied by computer science. And I want to introduce the work of Myers and Schroeder, their knowledge machines digital transformation of the sciences and humanities. So really culminating in the area that I now tread in between, which is the area of computer science and how that is affecting the way I approach anthropological research. So looking at part one, so the modernist project is very much wrapped up at the beginning of the 20th century. And we begin to see a visualization of anthropology. Can you hear me? Sorry, can you hear?
Yes, yes, Alison.
Okay, so let me know if you can't hear me. And so here I'm looking at language, literature, and the moving image. Our coding of the world is about giving meaning to the world. We know that different cultures code the world in different ways. Coding is the form of language, oral, textual, and the code of language that goes beyond narrative. The literary form adopts styles and registers that help encode a society made up of many voices and expressions. The author brings a subjectivity of the human experience into the realms of universal truths. We then look at cinema, the moving image, the great disruptor of the 20th century. Its ability to encode and recode human experience introduced a new way of seeing to the world. It played about with our ideas of time and methods of editing, confused and beguiled an audience confronted with another dimension of reality. Here, the disruption of the code of the 19th century we see in literature and the visual arts. But as Edward Ardener, a linguistic anthropologist, argued, that anthropology was part of the movement of modernism. Writing in 1997, Anna Grimshaw looks back at the parallels between the arrival of professional ethnographic studies and professional filmmaking. She pairs up the anthropologist Alfred Haddon and the famous pioneer filmmakers, the Lumieres. She sees Malinowski and Robert Flaherty having a shared project, Radcliffe Brown and John Grierson. Here, I will comment only on Malinowski and Flaherty, as we don't have time to look at the others during this lecture. But both she sees as visualized anthropology in their own way. But Malinowski shares some certain worldviews with Robert Flaherty. They both have a romantic vision of the ethnographic other, and they both write in text to explain their subject. Malinowski on the page and Flaherty on the intertitles of his silent films. Their shared cultural imagination, even though one is from Central Europe who immigrates to London and Flaherty, an American filmmaker, they share a Western-centric worldview, regarding the cultural other in the archipelagos of Melanesian New Guinea and the Inuits of Hudson Bay as something they could explain quite happily, without any irony. They would lead the reader or the audience to believe that they understood this cultural other, even though they barely knew them and had spent very little time considering with these people. Although Malinowski's connections in his Argonauts of the Western Pacific were extremely influential, and the Coolering obviously has a great influence on fieldwork and anthropology and is seen as a seminal work in anthropology. But both publish in 1922. Ezra Pound says that 1922 was year one in modernism, and 1922 is the year when T.S. Eliot publishes The Wasteland. It's a year of many publications, and 1922 goes down as a year that really divides the 19th century with the 20th century. But there is another person that we barely hear about in the talk of early 20th century work, and this is W.H. Rivers. W.H. Rivers was a founding father of psychology. And the reason he's quite well known in anthropological history is that he went with Alfred Haddon to the Torres Straits in 1898. And this is where the first recording, the first film recording was made by an anthropologist of the Australian Indigenous people. And Rivers learned a lot from that trip, and obviously spoke a lot with Alfred Haddon, who was a Cambridge anthropologist, and it influenced the way he saw the world. But Rivers was not like Malinowski, and this is where the discipline could have gone in a very different way. Malinowski was not particularly self-reflexive. And in Grimshaw's reading in 1997, she calls him not a modernist at all. She thinks that Rivers was much more part of this change in attitude and worldview that the modernists tried to pioneer. And Rivers visualized the interior space, a space where dream and memory were highly suggestive. He worked with the shell shock victims of World War I, and he believed that the dream world and the interior world was a world that we had to think about before we even attempted to explain the other. Grimshaw explains that the ethnographic other lay deeply entwined in a truly modernist experiment that spoke about the fragmented self, the self divided. And his was an attempt to bridge anthropology with psychology. And this multi-voice disposition in his methodologies also fell into the modernist paradigm that visual anthropology picks up on in 1997. And Grimshaw argues that there is a decisive change from that period, and it could have gone either way. Visual anthropology, therefore, in 1997, asks us to perceive a decisive shift of perspective from the past to the present, jumping through the work of Zygmunt Vertov, John Grierson, and Jean Rouch. We begin to align ourselves more with Rivers' less known attitude to method. She says, through a study of process of visualization, not just in the mind, but society itself. It can be argued, therefore, that Grimshaw is right when she says that Malinowski was perhaps not as modern as we first believe, as he was elevating human observation to a central place in the new science of anthropology, at a time when the human eye was being widely displaced elsewhere from its privileged position as a source of knowledge. Jean Berger writes that man was the eye for which reality has been made visible, the ideal eye, the eye of the viewing point of Renaissance perspective. So Grimshaw takes from Berger when he says that the Renaissance artist imitated nature. The mannerist and classic artist reconstructed examples of nature in order to transcend nature. The 19th century artist experienced nature, and the cubist realized his awareness was part of nature. So Grimshaw concludes in her chapter using Berger's metaphor of the mirror, saying that the cubist revolution was not just about seeing the world differently, it also involved a fundamental change in our relationship with the world. Her analysis of the effects of cinema and modernist discourse on the development not only of social anthropology as a discipline, but on the affiliations that anthropology had with the visual arts of the early 20th century, and creates a hotbed of potential for artists and social scientists for the generations that came after to take anthropology into many different directions. So just before we get to McLuhan, the 1997 edition of Rethinking Visual Anthropology was an attempt to reset the agenda from this early modernist viewpoint, where we still see the elite white male dictating our impressions of our own society in the West and those from any other part of the world, and reminds us that the first movements towards a new way of seeing that the world came with, this first movement towards this new way of seeing came with an attack on language, the language of the formal Western novel, the narrative. We see Conrad, Joyce, and Woolf all breaking with traditions in the way they are seeing the world. The effects of World War I cannot be overstated in its effect on the Western imagination. Malinowski's functionalist approach attempted to reset a shattered logic, to rearrange sets of truths that had embodied the Victorian and Edwardian eras, known for their confidence in facts, measurability of time, and containment of meaning. Malinowski's functionalism created not just units of culture, but a methodological revolution. But be aware, it was part fact and part fiction. Looking back at the propositions made in the introduction of Rethinking Anthropology, we can see how its authors wanted to note that the traditional bias of mainstream anthropology's ethnographic method as a way to collect data from relatively unknown realities, but it highlights the importance of methodology per se. As it states, it's important what we seek for what we discover. Each are connected. Recording of visual or visual phenomena obtain visual data, but they claim that that much which is observable about a culture can be recorded most effectively and comprehensively through film, photography, and drawing. But they add, the justification is not that the total recording of everything is possible, but rather that in neglecting visual data, we may be reflecting a Western bias, the elevating of the intellectual over the experimental or phenomenological, or neglecting the importance of visual phenomena across cultures. They add, by the use of film, photography, and drawing and so on, the anthropologist is able to make a permanent record of events and objects observed, to retain them for subsequent analysis or use them in further elicitation or information. And they conclude that visual recording methods have properties such that they are able to record more information than memory alone, or notebook and pencil, and that certain of them are indexically related to the reality they encode. So we see there that an agenda is set, a method is put down on paper, and it distinguishes itself because of the emphasis on the visual. We can look back on that as perhaps being slightly short-sighted, because the visual, as we know, is only one part of the world that we experience. But Gillian Gillison, also writing in 1997, reminds us that oral communication, i.e. the power of language in its most traditional form, that of storytelling, is central to all forms of communication. She says, the problematic status of visual codes and text are produced to communicate the computer programs, and shows how they necessitate recourse to oral communication. Her work with music and computers demonstrates that computer music, in effect, becomes dependent on an oral tradition for its users, in a way analogous to the oral exegeses on which anthropologists of art have always relied in their attempts to decode paintings and other images in the field. Although there is not enough room to discuss her chapter here, the reference to computer code brings us to the third area of discussion, or the second area here in my talk, that of the vast changes that have come about in methodologies in social science. So here's just a bridge really between the first and the third. It's important for us to understand that a lot was going on between the 1920s and the 1990s, and obviously I can't tell the whole history here, but Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man in 1964 were very, very influential in computer science development. And he was able to see the difference, that there was a real difference between paper media and what he called electronic media. And where others saw a great opportunities, he saw that there may be some cultural decline with the coming age of new technology. So McLuhan concluded that 4 things happen to all media and human artifact, and that this phenomenon was inevitable as they apply universally. So he insisted that all these things happen when each new media, such as radio, television, computer, all these different media that we work in, have their limitations. They might enhance, they might reverse, they might retrieve, and at some point they may become obsolete. And so these are the questions that we ask ourselves now, especially since the digital revolution, how a medium enhances the work we do as anthropologists. What does it make obsolete? What do we ignore now? What do we not take into account because we have this new technology available? What does the medium retrieve that has actually been forgotten beforehand? So there's some wonderful work of colorization of old photographs and bringing to life black and white films, and there's so much good work going on in bringing back to life archives at the moment. But there's the fourth side of this visual disruption that McLuhan really foresees very much as a Huxley or some visionary. McLuhan was a visionary in this type of media. What does the medium flip into which when pushed to extremes? So where does it break? At what point does it turn into something else? And this is a quote from Eliot. Where is, hang on, I can't, you can read it here. Where is the wisdom lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge lost in information? And this was written by T.S. Eliot in the 1920s, but it's pertinent today as we watch and we witness the change from knowledge to information to data. And it's very important for us to be aware of where we're seeking knowledge and how we're recording that knowledge. So this is one of my diagrams to show you the disruptions, the changes over time from 19th to 20th century. It's just to give you a few points of reference of how these new mediums came into play and how relatively young the medium of cinema and audio visual is. Sync sound was only available from 1960. So from 1960 to the end of the century, we gained so much momentum in technology. And this obviously had an effect on the way we not just saw the other, but how we felt about our own society. So we don't have the same security of knowing that things have been the same. If you'd bought a camera in 1920, that would still have been very, very operational at the end of the century. The camera that I bought to do my master's in 1998 was obsolete by 2002. The camera I bought in 2002 was obsolete in 2005. And we were discussing the short-lived technological expanse of each device that we buy, and how that has sped up, and how it affects the tapes that I recorded some of my work on. I can no longer play unless I digitize them into a different form. So formats have changed constantly, and over the last 20 years, looking back, if you think of the type of work that I've been doing, whereas I was a documentary filmmaker for television in 2002, making documentaries on tape and editing them on a 3-screen board in an editing studio, to learning how to do that myself on my own computer, understanding e-commerce, websites, how I digitized 16mm film in 2008 and made a film captured by women of film made in the 1930s. So I brought back that which was obsolete into a new digital life. But by 2012, the ebook that I was working on was almost at the end of its, almost before I'd finished making my ebook in iPad. It was not particularly the best medium to go with. And so I changed into looking at interactive documentaries online, and constantly I'm looking to think of forms of media that are going to be preserved for a long enough time for us to really learn from the knowledge that we're creating. So the digital artifact, just like us, is a socialist object and a socialized object. Here we look at the pictures on the screen of the sculptures that will inevitably last a lot longer than the digital elements that are being projected on the screen. And so we must be aware that we have to work both in analog and digital, because the analog invariably will last hundreds of years longer than the digital. We mustn't rely just on that. David Mcdougall is one of my favourite ethnographic filmmakers, and he's done lots of research in framing, and he studies a lot in India, and he's worked with lots of schools in India, and I'm very interested in education. And his films, Schoolscapes, look at different ways of framing culture in the digital context. But he works on linear film, but he also gives time to breathe looking at his films. They're slow. This is slow research. This is slow anthropology. This is not quick MTV editing. He has learned to look not just at the visual, he has broadened that outlook to the corporeal. And his book, The Corporeal Image, has got a lot to teach us about going beyond the visual. And so almost visual anthropology, maybe one of its failings is calling itself visual, when it actually is far more than the visual. So anthropology has changed the way the internet has changed the way that I work and produce my research. My film Captured by Women was made in 2011 about an archive, I think, of Ursula Bauer, and filmed in northeast India in the 1930s and 40s. So I tried to bring back to life some of her work and take it back to people who would know more about those communities. But just by digitizing it and making it accessible, we then have a new lease of life for that film. So the anthropologist can be a filmmaker and a digitizer. Online platforms such as YouTube have provoked a change of focus on the content we create and how we access and consume historical knowledge. The democratization of the moving image, where anyone can be a filmmaker and a broadcaster, opening up the visual worlds of the masses, of culturally different people. So here comes everybody. And this is one of the brilliant things about the internet and things like YouTube, but it's also, as we know, there are many dangers. So this is Ursula Bauer working in the 1930s and 40s in Nagaland, and we now are trying to produce multimedia digital products that will go with her archive, but it will be online and it will be a selection of different voices and not just the voice of the filmmaker about her work. And to go back to the beginning, anthropology is about witnessing the world. And one of the things that I am particularly interested in is mental health, and how the trauma of dislocation creates a body of people without a history. And so I'm looking and hoping to work more at recreating, reconnecting and retelling stories, so shared experience can be seen, whether it's through a smartphone, whether it's online. But these are things that we need to create. We need to create shared experiences to create shared identities. And that maybe it's a job of the anthropologist to witness these historical traumas that we see every day in the world and try to bring together some kind of cohesion. So there is a political, maybe not political in the sense of taking sides, but these histories need to be told, and I think that anthropologists are in a good place to tell them. So we go back, of course, to Apadurai, and there is a renewed sense that regardless of all this new digital energy, this new digital possibility, we're still only human, and we want to know about ourselves as much as about other people. I've worked with the Anglo-Indian communities, of which I form a part, in India, and have tried to create some online diaries to show the Anglo-Indian diaspora. And this is quite an interesting project. There's another big one in New Zealand that I am hoping to link to, where they are also trying to map out the diaspora of Anglo-Indians. So here you can see this slide. This new form of viewing is creating a fundamental change in not just what we view, the content, but how we view the diverse screens, how we visualize communication, change in the how to create AV information related to storytelling and language structures, and it affects our individual and cultural imagination. So this is a lady that I interviewed in her 100th year, talking about how she was treated when she came to England after having lived in India for many years. So the final part of my talk really is looking at the merge of computer science and anthropology. I'm part of a digital ethnography group at the Oxford Internet Institute, and this shows that anthropology has really gone walkabout, and computer science is very, I mean, we can't say, I cannot tell you how much funding there is in computer science, and anthropology has difficulty finding funding for research. So we will need to, in the future, connect with computer scientists who are doing fascinating work in the world on about all sorts of human behaviours, and we really need to understand more about it. I just want to read from this book, Knowledge Machines, where Myers and Schroeder set out the approach. To say that the transformation of digitizing research are merely changes in scale or speed is therefore misleading. When does quantitative change turn into qualitative change? Science and research more generally advance and gain more power over the natural and social environments. Nevertheless, it is possible to charter how change takes place in a variety of ways. Reorganizing disciplinary boundaries, changing day-to-day practices, shifting funding priorities, making more extensive and intensive use of computation, and more. These effects fan out across research fields, and gauging the cumulative gain in the power of research will tell us when a digital transformation has taken place. This is difficult to do across the board for all disciplines, though we have given a wide example here in this book. So instead, it's possible to examine advances in particular areas of research and in particular research communities by reference to the state of the art, and then to draw these analyses together to show how knowledge is being reshaped more generally. That's a very tiny little excerpt of this book, Knowledge Machines, which is really one of the, is an evidence of the many ways where computer scientists, often who have training themselves in anthropology, are moving into this new landscape. And here's a little diagram that's in this book of the e-scholarly communication layer in the e-research ecosystem. And this was created by Myers in 2009 for, first of all, an article, but it's also expanded and a little bit more detailed in the book, Knowledge Machines. It's just to flag up, if you like, some of the more recent things. So conclusions. So in 1997, we could see what did they think. They looked more about, they tried to draw away from this us and them into a multi-voiced world, which blurred these distinctions. They thought more about not just now and before, but the nows and befores. They deconstructed linear, single-voiced histories. They went from analog to digital. They tried to go from post-colonial theory to post-colonial method, from politicization of history to a refragmentation of the codes of political history, from single broadcast outlets to individual broadcast channels, from acceptable truths to multiple truths to partial truths, from objectivity of method to multi-subjectivities, and from single white man to pluralities of non-white and collaborations across nations. And so my final, if you like, little note for the conclusions here is, do we need to upskill anthropology practitioners to understand the process of digital transformation, prepared for a digital landscape? And I would say that as a practitioner myself, and now working within industry in digital archive management, among other things, I would say these things are absolutely important for you to be part of the next generation of research, not necessarily to become a filmmaker, but to understand how it's made, how film is made, the digitization process, digital publishing, multimedia publication, interactivity, and the codes of the internet. So I think I'll leave it there. Obviously, each needs a lot more explanation, but I hope I've made some sense into how life was, the plans for the project, and what's happened in some form since.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Alison. A wonderful lecture, and it was very interesting and very insightful to understand how anthropology has looked at different mediums, especially art, culture, psychology, and going on to public health issues like mental health. I'm sure there are a lot of queries and questions and reflections on your lecture, and I'm so glad to share that some of our colleagues, our students are with us to listen to you. I would like to welcome few of them to speak. Let's start with my colleague, Professor Sanghmitra Acharya, to share her views, and then I would go on with other faculty and also students. Yeah.
Thank you.
Professor Acharya.
Thank you, Dr. Reddy. And thank you so much, Dr. Alison, for this very, very informative talk that you shared with us. I'm not a trained anthropologist, but I do have interest in anthropological methodologies, which we as social scientists can use. And it really struck me when you said, when you talked about digitalizing of research, and it's connect with the anthropological methods. So I was just wondering, when we say digitalization of research, is it restricted to converting it into all visual forms, or it does have anything which is more specific, perhaps within the realm of anthropology, which a lot of social science research is now kind of using? So that was one, it just a thought which came to my mind, and I would really think you would, I would love to hear from you on that. Thank you.
Well, very aware of the restrictions that film it gives to a subject. So I think any of us looking at a documentary, or if there are specialists in your subject, you will be shouting at the screen saying, that's not correct, they've oversimplified. AV is often a massive oversimplification if it's told in a narrative form. So filmmakers and anthropologists have often had lots of fights because the anthropologist wants the detail of the society and give it all and the filmmaker wants to make the film watchable from an audience. Yeah. So they have different audiences, so we're very aware. There's one big question when I used to run the Ethnographic Film Society here in Oxford was, can the ethnographic film stand alone? You know, it needs text, it needs explanation. So my answer to the idea of digitizing research, well, digitizing itself, we are doing that with archives, manuscripts. You know, there's a whole range of ways that we digitize to make it a digital document. But what do we actually see? What do we actually refer to? Well, audiovisual, it was said in 2016 that it made up about 80% of the internet. And if you think that the amount of AV that we are all now consuming, we must be really aware of where it's coming from, how it's made. We mustn't be too gullible, and we have to recognize what is good research. You know, what are the standards that we, in your discipline, in my discipline, what do we expect? What kind of knowledge are we expecting? But we must also see that audiovisual has many different, many limitations. And that's why I often listen to radio programs, because I prefer radio as a medium, because I can use my own imagination. Knowing how to use a camera and a sound machine recorder is really vital in many subjects and across all the social sciences. But it comes with ethical reservations. And so it's not just about taking a camera and filming anyone or anything in all sorts of situations. This is not really the aim of the ethnographer or the trained anthropologist, because we have to understand the dynamics that a camera brings into each situation and the performative behaviors of those who are being filmed. So there are many people who have written extensively on this. I think that it's a very useful tool to know how to use, because we can share information. Sometimes people will only understand when they see it themselves, a situation. So when I was asked once to film for the Age UK. So Age UK is a charity funded by the government to look after the elderly. And they were given some money, but they were only given more money when they could show what they were doing with the money they had been given. So interviewing the elderly people who were benefiting from this fund was very useful, because when it went back to Parliament, to the House of Commons, people didn't want to read through loads of text. They just wanted to see people in their environment telling people, this is so helpful. Somebody comes and takes me out of my bed in the morning. I get food at lunchtime before I couldn't get to the shops. And so this first-hand account of oral witness, of an oral communication is very useful for raising funds for certain areas that we might deal in.
Thank you. I would like to ask Dr. Pandya to share his views.
Yeah, just let me get the mic on. That was very interesting talk. I really enjoyed it, and in fact, it brought back a lot of memories of going through trying to do visual ethnography and visual anthropology in Andamans. I wanted to get some comment or some reaction from you that now, with the development of technology and particularly the digital media becoming much more portable, it's an interesting situation that before I could only do ethnography on the culture or the community I was working with. The community now demands to do work. So they want to see what I have recorded and they want to edit it. So they create an ethnography on the visual records by saying, this actually is a mischief. This person is trying to tell you wrong things. I will tell you what is wrong. So there's an accumulation of meta discourses which have to be coded. So what happens when we really write the ethnography, or when we really do textualize the experience of the camera and the person? All these things have to be considered. So who are we going to really represent when people themselves have started representing or want to represent from the medium which we use them to represent? But in some sense, they have created their own critique of a kind of colonial methodology of depicting them. I would like to know what your experiences are or how you feel about it.
Yes, thank you very much. It's the $1 million question. Thank you very much for that. Absolutely, that is the question about whose voice counts, who's representing whom. And if you're holding a camera, that in itself is a political act. You are focusing on what you want to see. Now, that may not be something that is appropriate for the community. Obviously, even if permissions are given, that may not be the consensus of all. It might just be consensus of some. So who are we trying to represent? And it's interesting, one of my filmmaker friends went with Marcus Banks actually to India, and he knew that he was so in awe of all the amazing things that he saw in the street. He wanted to film everything because it was so colorful and so everyone was so interesting. But the anthropologist said to him, listen, you have to get rid of your view of trying to see everything and just try to see something. And this is really important, that some voices can be recorded. There's always now must be a collaboration. I filmed in Northeast India last year. When I went, I brought a couple of my students who are Indian with me, but I also worked with the indigenous young guys who could hold a camera. A lot of them were photographers. They didn't know what documentary really was, but they knew how to make videos, like music videos. So this was a collaboration. There were 10 filmmakers. They were all going out to see things. Some of them spoke the language. They were all looking at different things. And then I brought back all that information and I edited it. And then I said to my filmmakers, is this what you want? Is this how you wanted your films to be seen? So I think this collaboration with us, we are the teacher, we're the translator, we're the interpreter, but we're not the all and we're not the authority of everything. We can only facilitate, and we can comment and interpret, of course, when we're writing our papers, but the representative nature of our work must be a collaborative one, and it must be a cross-cultural collaboration, because my Indian students who came from Kerala and Delhi and Chennai, they had no idea about Northeast India. They were complete foreigners in their own country, just like I am when I go to Scotland or Ireland. You know, this isn't my culture. These are different. There's different people doing different things. So I cannot attempt to talk for them. I can only talk with them. Does that make sense?